Have you ever stood at the grave of someone you loved more than life itself, only to have a complete stranger shatter everything you thought you knew about them? I'm talking about the kind of moment that splits your entire existence into before and after. Well, that's exactly what happened to me on a cold November morning that I'll never forget. There I was, kneeling on the damp grass, my fingers tracing the letters of her name carved into the granite headstone, when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't turn around at first because, honestly, I was too lost in my grief, too consumed by the overwhelming emptiness that had become my constant companion. The rain had started as a light drizzle, mixing with the tears streaming down my face, and I remember thinking how fitting it was that even the sky seemed to be crying with me. But then I heard a voice, deep and weathered, say something that would change my life forever. She was my daughter, the stranger said, and I felt my entire body freeze. My heart stopped beating for what felt like an eternity because Sarah had always told me she had no family, that she was completely alone in this world, that I was all she had. I slowly turned around to see a man in his late 60s, impeccably dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car, standing there with tears glistening in his eyes that were the exact same shade of green as Sarah's had been. The resemblance was unmistakable once I really looked at him, the same delicate bone structure in the face, the same way of holding himself with quiet dignity, even in the midst of obvious pain. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out because my mind was racing with 1,000 questions. 1,000 contradictions to everything I thought I knew about the woman I had loved with every fiber of my being. Who was this man? Why had Sarah never mentioned him? And more importantly, why had she lied to me about being alone? The stranger extended his hand toward me, and I noticed it was trembling slightly. "My name is Richard Ashford," he said, and even in my grief-stricken state I recognized that name immediately because anyone who read the business section of any newspaper would know Richard Ashford, the billionaire real estate mogul whose empire stretched across 3 continents. But what was he doing here at Sarah's grave, claiming to be her father when she had explicitly told me she had no parents, no siblings, no one? I remember the way my legs felt weak beneath me, how I had to grip the headstone to steady myself because the ground suddenly felt like it was shifting under my feet. This man, this impossibly wealthy stranger, was telling me that the love of my life, the woman who had shared my tiny apartment and seemed perfectly content with our modest existence, was his daughter. It made no sense, and yet as I looked into those familiar green eyes, I knew with a sinking certainty that he was telling the truth. The silence between us stretched out, filled only with the sound of rain hitting the leaves of the oak tree that stood guard over her final resting place. I had so many questions burning in my throat, but I couldn't seem to form coherent words because my entire reality was crumbling around me. Everything I thought I knew about Sarah, about our relationship, about the future we had planned together, was suddenly thrown into question. Had she been lying to me all along? Was our entire relationship built on deception? And if so, why? What could possibly have made her hide something so fundamental about herself? Richard Ashford stood there patiently, as if he understood that I needed time to process this revelation, and I found myself studying his face more carefully, searching for more traces of the woman I had lost. The way he furrowed his brow was exactly like Sarah did when she was thinking deeply about something. The slight tilt of his head, the aristocratic slope of his nose, even the way he clasped his hands in front of him, all of it reminded me of her in ways that made my chest ache with fresh grief. I finally found my voice, though it came out rough and broken. "She told me she had no family," I managed to say, and even to my own ears it sounded like an accusation. Richard's face crumpled slightly, a flash of pain crossing his distinguished features. "I know," he replied softly, and those 2 words carried the weight of what seemed like years of regret and sorrow. The rain was falling harder now, soaking through my jacket, but I didn't care because I was already numb from cold and shock and grief that had just taken on an entirely new dimension. This man, this billionaire father that Sarah had hidden from me, stood before me like a ghost from a past I never knew existed, and I realized that I was about to learn things about the woman I loved that would either help me understand her better or destroy the beautiful memories I had been clinging to since her death. My mind flashed back to all the times I had asked Sarah about her family, how she would get this distant look in her eyes and change the subject so smoothly that I barely noticed we had moved on to talking about something else entirely. I had assumed she was an orphan, maybe raised in foster care or by distant relatives who had passed away. She had never explicitly said that, but she had allowed me to believe it through her silence and careful redirections. Now, standing here in the rain with her father, I understood that her silence had been a deliberate choice, a wall she had built between her past and the life she had chosen to live with me. But why? What could drive someone to completely cut off their family, especially a family with the kind of wealth and resources that the Ashford name implied? I thought about our life together, how Sarah had worked as a kindergarten teacher, how we had saved for months to afford a weekend trip to the beach, how she had been so excited when we found a vintage lamp at a thrift store for our living room. None of it made sense if she came from money, if she had a billionaire father who presumably could have given her anything she wanted, unless she was running from something, or hiding from something, or maybe protecting something. The questions swirled in my mind like a storm, each one leading to 10 more, and I felt like I was drowning in uncertainty and betrayal and grief all mixed together into something I couldn't even name. I found myself staring at Richard Ashford with a mixture of anger and desperate curiosity, because this man held answers that I desperately needed, even though part of me was terrified of what those answers might be. "Why are you here?" I finally asked, my voice barely above a whisper but somehow cutting through the sound of the rain that was now falling in sheets around us. Richard looked down at the grave, at the simple headstone that I had chosen because it was all I could afford on my salary as a high school English teacher, and I saw something like shame cross his features. "Because I never stopped looking for her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Because I've been searching for my daughter for the past 5 years, ever since she walked out of my house and told me she never wanted to see me again." His words hit me like a physical blow because Sarah and I had been together for 4 years, which meant she had left her father's house just a year before we met. A year before she had literally run into me at a coffee shop, spilling my latte all over my shirt, and apologizing so profusely that I couldn't help but laugh and ask her to have coffee with me to make up for it. That moment had felt like fate, like the universe conspiring to bring us together. But now I wondered if she had been running from her old life, straight into the arms of someone who knew nothing about it, someone who couldn't connect her to the world she was trying to escape. I remembered how she had seemed so relieved when I told her about my simple life, my small circle of friends, my complete lack of interest in high society or wealth or anything that might have connected me to her father's world. Had she chosen me specifically because I was safe, because I represented everything her old life wasn't? The thought made me feel sick because I had always believed that Sarah loved me for who I was, not for what I wasn't. "Why did she leave?" I asked, needing to understand what could have caused such a complete rupture between a father and daughter. Richard's eyes met mine, and I saw such profound sadness there that for a moment, my anger softened into something closer to pity. "Because I tried to control her life," he admitted, his voice breaking slightly. "Because I arranged a marriage for her to the son of a business associate, someone I thought would be a suitable match, someone who came from the right family and could help expand our business empire. I thought I was doing what was best for her, what would secure her future and give her the life she deserved. I never stopped to ask what she wanted, what would make her happy. I just assumed that I knew better, that my experience and wisdom gave me the right to make those decisions for her." He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "She begged me to call off the engagement, told me she didn't love him, that she couldn't imagine spending her life with someone she barely knew. But I was stubborn and arrogant, and so convinced that I was right. I told her she would learn to love him, that romantic love was overrated and that security and status were more important. We fought terribly that night, said things that can never be unsaid. She told me I had never really seen her as a person, only as a pawn in my business games. And then she left, walked out with nothing but a suitcase and her mother's necklace, the only thing I couldn't buy or control because my wife, God rest her soul, had given it to Sarah before she died. I felt my throat tighten as I listened to him because suddenly so many things about Sarah made sense. The way she had valued authenticity above everything else. How she had always insisted that we make decisions together no matter how small. How she had sometimes gotten this fierce look in her eyes when we watched movies where parents tried to control their children's lives. She had been living in reaction to her past, building a life that was the complete opposite of what her father had wanted for her. And I had been part of that rebellion, whether I knew it or not. I was the choice she had made for herself, the life she had claimed on her own terms. The realization should have made me feel honored, chosen, but instead, It made me feel like maybe I had never really known her at all, like our entire relationship had been shadowed by secrets I couldn't see. She never told me any of this, I said, and I hated how small and hurt my voice sounded. She never told me about you, about her past, about where she came from. We talked about getting married, about having children someday, about growing old together, and she never once mentioned that she had a father who was looking for her. Richard nodded slowly, fresh tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. I'm not surprised, he said quietly. Sarah was always stubborn, always committed to her decisions once she made them. If she decided to leave her old life behind completely, she would have done it thoroughly, burned every bridge to make sure she couldn't go back even if she wanted to. It's something she got from me, actually. That absolute determination and refusal to compromise. He gave a bitter laugh. Ironic, isn't it? The very trait that made me think I could control her life was the same trait that gave her the strength to walk away from everything. The rain began to let up slightly, though the sky remained heavy and gray, matching the weight pressing down on my chest. I thought about Sarah's apartment when we first started dating, how sparse it had been, just the basics and nothing more. She had told me she believed in minimalism, in living simply, and I had admired that about her because it seemed so pure and intentional. Now I wondered if it had been less about philosophy and more about practicality, about starting over with nothing and building a life from scratch. Had she sold the expensive things she must have owned, the designer clothes and jewelry and whatever else came with being a billionaire's daughter? Or had she truly left with nothing but a suitcase, walking away from a life of luxury without a second glance? I realized I was crying again, not just for the loss of Sarah, but for the loss of the version of her I thought I knew. Every memory was now tinged with questions, every sweet moment shadowed by the secrets she had kept. When she had held my hand and told me I was her whole world, had she meant it, or was she just grateful to have escaped her old world? When she had cried tears of joy at my simple proposal with the modest ring I had saved for months to buy, was she truly happy? Or was she relieved that this was nothing like the arranged marriage her father had tried to force on her? The questions were eating me alive from the inside, but I knew I needed to hear more, needed to understand the full story, even if it hurt. When did you find out she had died? I asked Richard, watching as he visibly flinched at the question. He took a deep breath, steadying himself against the wave of grief that I could see washing over him. 3 weeks ago, he finally answered, his voice hoarse with emotion. I had hired private investigators from the very beginning, the moment I realized she wasn't coming back. They searched for her for years, following every lead, checking every Sarah Ashford in the country. But she was smart. She had changed her name legally, started using her mother's maiden name, Miller, Sarah Miller. Such a common name, so easy to disappear into. She got a new social security number somehow, created an entirely new identity. My investigators finally tracked her down 2 months ago, found out she was living here, working as a teacher, living with someone. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Living with you. I was preparing to contact her, trying to figure out the right approach, the right words to say after 5 years of silence. I had rehearsed 1,000 apologies in my mind, imagined 1,000 different scenarios of how our reunion might go. And then 3 weeks ago, my investigator called to tell me she had died in a car accident. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt the familiar crushing weight of that reality settling over me once again. The car accident that had taken Sarah from me had been so sudden, so senseless. She had been driving home from the school's evening parent-teacher conferences when a drunk driver had run a red light and hit her car broadside. She had died before the ambulance even arrived, they told me. I had been waiting at home with dinner in the oven, wondering why she was running late, not knowing that I would never see her alive again. That was 6 weeks ago, and the pain was still so fresh, so raw, that sometimes I forgot how to breathe. I couldn't come to the funeral, Richard continued, his voice breaking. I found out 2 days after it had already happened. I'm sorry you had to plan it alone. Sorry you had to bear that burden by yourself. If I had known earlier, if I had found her sooner, maybe things would have been different. I shook my head because I couldn't bear to go down that road of what-ifs and maybes. Why are you telling me all this now? I asked, needing to understand his motivation for approaching me today, for shattering my grief with these revelations. Why not just leave it alone? She's gone, and whatever secrets she kept, she took them with her. Richard reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out an envelope, slightly damp from the rain. Because there's something you need to know, he said, extending it toward me. Something Sarah never got the chance to tell you herself. My hand trembled as I took the envelope from him, and I noticed my name written on the front in handwriting that I didn't recognize. "What is this?" I asked, though part of me wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Open it," Richard urged gently. "Please." I carefully tore open the envelope and pulled out several pieces of paper. The first was a letter, handwritten in Sarah's distinctive looping script that I knew so well from the little notes she used to leave for me around the apartment. "My dearest love," it began, and I had to pause because seeing her words, hearing her voice in my head as I read them, made the grief surge up so powerfully that I almost couldn't continue. "If you're reading this, it means something has happened to me, and I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for leaving you alone. Sorry for all the secrets I kept. Sorry for not being brave enough to tell you the truth while I had the chance. I've written this letter so many times over the past few months trying to find the right words, but there are no right words for what I need to tell you. I can only hope that you'll understand, that you'll forgive me, and that you'll believe me when I say that every moment we shared was real and true, even if it was built on a foundation of things I couldn't bring myself to reveal." My eyes were blurring with tears, but I forced myself to keep reading. "You deserve to know the truth about who I was before I met you, about the life I left behind and why I left it. My name was Sarah Ashford, and my father is Richard Ashford. Yes, that Richard Ashford. I grew up in a world of wealth and privilege, but also of control and expectations that suffocated me. When my father arranged my marriage to someone I didn't love, someone I could never love, I realized I had a choice to make. I could stay and live the life he had planned for me, a life of luxury and emptiness, or I could leave and try to find something real, something that was truly mine. So I left, and I never looked back, until I met you." I had to stop reading for a moment because my chest was so tight I could barely breathe. Sarah had written this letter, had planned for this moment, had known there was a chance I would find out the truth someday. When I met you at that coffee shop, it was the first time in a year that I had felt genuinely happy. You were so kind, so real, so completely different from everyone I had known in my old life. You didn't care about status or money or any of the things that had defined my world before. You cared about books and your students and making people laugh and all the beautiful, simple things that I had forgotten existed. Falling in love with you was the easiest thing I've ever done, and also the most terrifying, because I knew I was building our relationship on a foundation of secrets. I wanted to tell you the truth so many times, but I was afraid. Afraid you would see me differently. Afraid you would think our love wasn't real. Afraid you would leave me once you knew who I really was." The letter went on, and with each word, I felt like I was discovering a Sarah I had never known, and yet she was still the same woman I had loved. She wrote about her mother, who had died when Sarah was 16, and how losing her had left her vulnerable to her father's attempts to control her life. She wrote about the months after she left when she had worked minimum wage jobs and lived in a tiny studio apartment that had mice and a radiator that barely worked, and how she had never been happier because it was hers, earned by her own efforts. She wrote about the moment she decided to become a teacher, wanting to make a difference in children's lives the way her mother had always encouraged her to do. And then, in the final paragraphs, she wrote something that made my heart stop completely. "There's something else you need to know, my love. Something I've been trying to find the courage to tell you for the past 2 months. I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby. I found out 6 weeks ago, and I've been carrying this secret along with our child, trying to figure out the right time to tell you. I know we've talked about wanting children someday, but this is happening sooner than we planned, and I'm terrified and excited and overwhelmed all at once. I've also been wrestling with whether this changes things, whether I need to reach out to my father, whether our child deserves to know their grandfather even if I'm not ready to forgive him for what he did. I've scheduled an appointment with my doctor for next week, and I've decided that after I confirm everything is healthy and progressing well, I'm going to tell you. I'm going to tell you about the baby, and about my past, and about everything. I'm going to give you the choice I never had, the choice to decide for yourself if you still want this life with me, once you know the whole truth." The letter ended there, with her signature, and a small heart drawn next to my name. I felt my legs give out completely, and I sank to the ground right there in the wet grass next to her grave. She had been pregnant. Sarah had been carrying our child when she died, and I never knew. The revelation hit me like a tsunami, drowning me in a grief so profound that I couldn't even cry anymore. I just sat there, the letter clutched in my shaking hands, my mouth open in a silent scream as the full weight of what I had lost crashed down on me. I hadn't just lost the woman I loved, I had lost our future, our family, our child who would never be born. Richard knelt down beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder, and we stayed there together in the rain. Two men united in grief for the woman we had both loved and lost. "I'm so sorry," he kept saying over and over, and I didn't know if he was apologizing for the loss, or for approaching me, or for all the years of control that had driven Sarah away in the first place. Maybe he was apologizing for all of it. I don't know how long we sat there, but eventually, Richard helped me to my feet and guided me to a bench under a nearby shelter. He handed me the other papers from the envelope, and with numb fingers, I looked through them. Medical records confirming Sarah's pregnancy, dated from 8 weeks before her death. A copy of her will, which I hadn't known existed, leaving everything to me and naming me as the executor of her estate, though I had assumed she had nothing to leave. And finally, another letter, this one addressed to Richard, in the same handwriting that I now recognized as Sarah's. "You can read it if you want," Richard said quietly. "She wrote it the same day she wrote yours." I found both letters in her apartment after the accident, along with instructions about what to do if something happened to her. With trembling hands, I unfolded Sarah's letter to her father. "Dear Dad," it began, and even through my shock and grief, I noticed she had called him Dad. Not Richard or father, but Dad, the intimate name of a daughter who still loved her father despite everything. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and I'm sorry we never got the chance to reconcile. I've thought about reaching out to you so many times over the years, but pride and fear always stopped me. Pride because I didn't want to admit that maybe I missed you, missed having a father in my life. Fear because I was terrified you would try to control me again. Or worse, that you wouldn't want anything to do with me after I defied you so completely. But I want you to know that leaving was the right decision for me, even if it caused both of us pain. I needed to find out who I was, separate from your expectations, separate from the Ashford name and all the weight it carries. And I did find myself. I found a life I loved, a career that fulfilled me, and a man who saw me for who I truly am, not for who I was supposed to be. His name is David, and he's the kindest, most genuine person I've ever known. He's a teacher, like me, and he believes in the power of literature to change lives. He makes me laugh every single day, and he loves me without conditions or expectations. When I'm with him, I don't have to be Sarah Ashford, heiress and disappointment. I can just be Sarah, and that's enough. I'm pregnant with his child, Dad. You're going to be a grandfather, or you would have been if I had lived long enough to tell you. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about whether our baby deserves to know you, to have you in their life. I've been considering reaching out, trying to build bridges between my old life and my new one, because despite everything, I never stopped loving you. I just couldn't live the life you wanted for me. I had to pause in my reading, because the words were blurring together, not just from the rain but from the tears that wouldn't stop falling. Sarah had been planning to reconcile with her father. She had been preparing to bring our two worlds together, to let me into her past while building our future. And then she had died, before any of it could happen, leaving both Richard and me with nothing but regrets and questions and this terrible, aching emptiness. I need you to do something for me. Sarah's letter to Richard continued. I need you to find David if something happens to me. Tell him the truth about who I was, about where I came from. Give him the letter I've written for him. And please, please don't judge him or try to control him the way you tried to control me. He's not part of your world and he doesn't want to be. But he loved me truly and completely, and he deserves to know the whole story. If I had lived, I would have told him myself. But if I didn't get that chance, I need you to do it for me. And Dad, I need you to help him. He doesn't have much money, and I know the funeral and everything else will be a financial burden on him. Please use some of the trust fund Mom left me to help him. Not because he needs your charity, but because I would have wanted to make sure he was taken care of. He's going to blame himself for not knowing I was pregnant, for not protecting me better, for 1,000 things that weren't his fault. Help him see that none of this was his fault, that life is just cruel and unfair sometimes. And if you can, tell him about Mom, about how much she would have loved him, about how she always told me that real love was worth fighting for, worth sacrificing for. Tell him that's why I left, because I was fighting for the chance to find real love, and I found it with him. The letter ended with words that broke both Richard and me completely. I love you, Dad. I always have, Even when I was angry, even when we weren't speaking. I hope you can forgive me for leaving the way I did. And I hope you can forgive yourself for the mistakes you made. We all make them. The key is learning from them. If you're reading this, please learn from mine. Don't let pride or fear keep you from the people you love. Life is too short, and tomorrow is never guaranteed. Tell the people you love that you love them while you still have the chance. I wish I had. With all my love, Sarah. Have you ever experienced a moment where everything you thought you knew gets turned upside down? Where grief becomes even more complicated because it's mixed with revelation and regret? Comment below if you've ever discovered something important about someone after they were gone. Richard and I sat in silence for a long time after I finished reading both letters, neither of us able to speak through the emotion that overwhelmed us. The rain had stopped completely now, and weak sunlight was trying to break through the clouds, creating strange shadows across the cemetery. I looked at Richard Ashford, this billionaire who had lost his daughter twice, once when she walked away, and once when she died. And I saw not a powerful businessman, but a broken father who would give anything for a chance to make things right. She asked me to help you, Richard finally said, his voice rough with unshed tears. And I want to honor her wishes. I want to do what I should have done when she was alive, which is listen and respect what she wanted instead of imposing my will. I shook my head, feeling overwhelmed and confused and still so deeply in shock. I don't need your money, I said, though even as I said it, I knew it wasn't entirely true. The funeral had depleted my savings, and I was struggling to keep up with bills while dealing with my grief. But accepting help from Richard felt like betraying Sarah somehow, like I was becoming part of the world she had run from. It's not my money, Richard corrected gently. It's Sarah's. She had a trust fund from her mother, separate from anything I could control. It's been sitting there for 5 years earning interest waiting for her. Legally, as her executor according to her will, you have the right to access it. I'm not giving you anything, I'm just making sure you get what Sarah wanted you to have. He pulled out another envelope, this one containing legal documents. There's $3 million in that trust fund, he said, and I felt my breath catch because that was an incomprehensible amount of money to someone who had been living paycheck to paycheck. Sarah wanted you to have it, to use it to build the life you would have built together. Maybe go back to school if you want, or write that novel you've always talked about, or start the literacy program for underprivileged kids that Sarah mentioned in her diary. Whatever you choose, it's yours without strings or conditions. I stared at the documents, unable to process what he was saying. $3 million. Sarah had been worth $3 million and had never mentioned it, had lived in our tiny apartment and worked her teaching job and clipped coupons for grocery shopping, all while having access to more money than I would make in a lifetime. It should have made me angry, but instead it just made me sad because it showed how determined she had been to live authentically, to build a life based on what she earned rather than what she had been given. I don't know what to say, I admitted, feeling lost and overwhelmed. Richard gave me a sad smile. You don't have to say anything right now. Take time to process all of this. But there's one more thing. He hesitated, as if unsure how to continue. I would like to be part of your life if you'll allow it. Not because I'm trying to control you or obligate you in any way, but because you're the last connection I have to my daughter. You knew her in ways I never did, saw sides of her that she kept hidden from me, and according to her letters, you are going to be the father of my grandchild. That creates a bond between us, whether we asked for it or not. I thought about that, about this unexpected connection to a man I had never known existed until an hour ago. It felt strange and complicated and yet somehow right, because we were both grieving the same loss, both trying to make sense of a life cut short, both wishing we could turn back time and make different choices. I need time, I said finally. Time to process all of this, to figure out what it means, to decide what I want to do. This is all too much to take in right now. Richard nodded understandingly. Of course. Take all the time you need. He pulled out a business card and handed it to me. When you're ready to talk, call me. No pressure, no expectations, just two people who loved Sarah trying to honor her memory in the way she would have wanted. We stood up from the bench, and Richard walked with me back to Sarah's grave. We stood there together looking at the headstone, and I felt the weight of everything that had been lost, everything that would never be. Sarah was gone, and with her, our future, our child, all the dreams we had whispered to each other late at night. But she had also left something behind, a legacy of love and courage and the determination to live life on her own terms. And somehow, Knowing the whole truth about her, understanding the sacrifice she had made to be with me, made me love her even more. "I think she would have liked that we met," Richard said softly. "I think she would have wanted us to support each other through this grief, to keep her memory alive by being the kind of people she believed we could be." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Richard placed his hand on the headstone for a moment, his fingers tracing Sarah's name the same way mine had earlier. "Goodbye, sweetheart," he whispered. "I'm so sorry I didn't get the chance to tell you I was proud of you, proud of the woman you became, proud of the choices you made even when they took you away from me. You were braver than I ever was, and I love you more than I ever told you." Then he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with Sarah's grave and the weight of knowledge that changed everything and nothing all at once. I sank back down to my knees in the grass, placing my hand on the cool granite. "I wish you had told me," I said out loud, speaking to her as if she could hear me. "I wish you had trusted me with your secrets. But I understand why you didn't, and I don't love you any less. If anything, I love you more for having the courage to choose the life you wanted, even when it meant giving up everything else." Over the following weeks, I found myself in a strange new reality where everything had shifted but remained somehow the same. I still went to work, still taught my English classes, still came home to an empty apartment that echoed with Sarah's absence. But now there were lawyers to meet with, documents to sign, a trust fund to access, and phone calls with Richard Ashford that gradually became less awkward and more comfortable. We met for coffee sometimes, just to talk about Sarah, to share memories and stories that helped both of us feel connected to her. Richard told me about Sarah as a child, about how she had loved to read fantasy novels and would create elaborate imaginary worlds, about how she had insisted on adopting every stray animal she found and had turned their mansion's pool house into a sanctuary for injured birds. I told him about Sarah as an adult, about how she had cried at every single one of her students' graduations, about how she collected vintage teacups from thrift stores and insisted on using a different one each morning, about how she sang off-key in the shower and burned cookies every time she tried to bake but never stopped trying. Through these conversations, we pieced together a more complete picture of who Sarah had been, bridging the gap between the daughter he remembered and the woman I had loved. And slowly, painfully, I began to understand the full scope of her sacrifice. She had given up wealth, status, family connections, and security to pursue something that couldn't be bought or arranged, genuine love and authentic happiness. She had chosen poverty and uncertainty over a guaranteed comfortable life because she valued freedom and truth above everything else. And she had chosen me not because I was a consolation prize or an act of rebellion, but because I represented the life she truly wanted, stripped of pretense and expectation. One evening, about 2 months after that fateful meeting at the cemetery, Richard invited me to his estate. I had been avoiding it, not ready to confront the physical reality of the world Sarah had left behind, but Richard said there were things of Sarah's he wanted me to have, things that rightfully belonged to me now. The drive to the Ashford estate took me to a part of the city I rarely visited, where the homes were set back from the road behind gates and manicured lawns that looked like park grounds. When I pulled up to the address Richard had given me, I sat in my car for a moment staring at the massive iron gates with the Ashford family crest worked into the design. This had been Sarah's home, the place she had grown up, the place she had fled from. A security guard let me in after confirming my identity, and I drove up a winding driveway that seemed to go on forever, lined with oak trees that must have been hundreds of years old. The house itself was more like a palace, 3 stories of classical architecture with columns and balconies and more windows than I could count. It was beautiful in an intimidating way, and I could understand why Sarah had felt suffocated here, surrounded by all this grandeur and expectation. Richard met me at the front door himself, dismissing the butler who had started to answer my knock. "Thank you for coming," he said, and I could see he was nervous, perhaps worried that I would judge him for his wealth or blame him for the opulence that had driven Sarah away. But I wasn't there to judge. I was there to understand, to see the world that had shaped the woman I loved. He led me through rooms that looked like they belonged in a museum, all marble and crystal and artwork that was probably worth more than my entire neighborhood. We climbed a grand staircase and walked down a long hallway until we reached a door that Richard paused before opening. "I haven't changed anything," he said quietly. "I kept hoping she would come back someday." He opened the door, and I stepped into Sarah's childhood bedroom, a space frozen in time. It was surprisingly normal for a billionaire's daughter. painted in soft lavender with white furniture and shelves overflowing with books. There were posters on the walls of bands I recognized, photographs of Sarah with friends, ribbons from horse riding competitions, a collection of snow globes on the dresser. But what caught my attention was the wall opposite the bed, covered in a massive collage of pictures, quotes, and clippings that Sarah had assembled. Dreams and goals written in her handwriting, pictures of teachers who had inspired her, quotes about living authentically and choosing your own path. In the center of it all was a photograph of her mother, a beautiful woman with Sarah's eyes and smile, and beneath it, Sarah had written, "Be brave enough to create the life you dream of, not the life others expect." I walked closer to the collage, reading the words Sarah had collected, seeing her dreams laid out like a roadmap. Teach children to love learning. Find someone who sees the real you. Live simply but deeply. Choose courage over comfort. Every single one of these dreams she had achieved. She had become a teacher who inspired her students. She had found someone who saw and loved the real her. She had lived simply but with profound depth and meaning. And she had chosen courage over comfort when she walked away from all of this. She made this when she was 17, Richard said from behind me, right after her mother died. I remember being confused by it, maybe even a little angry because some of those dreams seemed so small compared to what I thought she should want. I wanted her to dream of running the family business, of expanding our empire, of making her mark on the world of finance and real estate. But she dreamed of teaching and love and simplicity. I thought she was wasting her potential. His voice broke. I was such a fool. She wasn't wasting her potential. She was defining success on her own terms. And she achieved every single thing she set out to do, despite me, despite all the obstacles I put in her way. I turned to look at Richard and saw tears streaming down his face. This powerful man who commanded boardrooms and built empires was broken by the realization of what he had lost through his own stubbornness. She forgave you, I said, because it was true and because he needed to hear it. In her letter, she told you she loved you. She was planning to reach out to let you be part of our lives and our child's life. She forgave you, Richard. The question is, can you forgive yourself? He sobbed then, the kind of deep, wrenching sobs that come from years of suppressed grief and regret. I stood there awkwardly for a moment before doing what felt right. I stepped forward and embraced this man who was a stranger and yet family, connected to me through our shared love for a woman who was gone. We stood there in Sarah's childhood bedroom, two broken men holding each other up, crying for the loss of someone who had been everything to both of us. Do you know what it feels like to find family in the most unexpected places? Share your thoughts in the comments. After we had both composed ourselves, Richard showed me the boxes he had packed, full of Sarah's things from this room. Journals from her teenage years, photograph albums, jewelry that had belonged to her mother, books with her notes in the margins, and countless other treasures that told the story of who she had been before she became the Sarah I knew. I want you to have all of it, Richard said. These are pieces of her history and they belong with you now. And there's something else. He walked to the closet and pulled out a small velvet box. This was going to be her wedding present from me before she left. It's her mother's engagement ring, a family heirloom that's been passed down for 4 generations. I had it sized for Sarah, but I never got the chance to give it to her. He opened the box to reveal a stunning vintage ring, an emerald-cut diamond surrounded by smaller stones in a platinum setting that must have been 70 or 80 years old. I know you already proposed to her with your own ring, Richard continued, and I know she loved that ring because it came from you, from your heart and your hard-earned money. But I want you to have this too, not to replace what you gave her but to add to it. Maybe someday, if you have a daughter, you could pass it along to her. Keep the tradition alive. I took the box with trembling hands, looking at the ring that represented generations of Ashford women. Women Sarah had descended from but had chosen not to be defined by. Thank you, I managed to say. I'll treasure it, and if I ever have a daughter, I'll make sure she knows it came from her grandmother and her mother's family. Richard smiled sadly. Sarah would have made such a wonderful mother. She had so much love to give, and she would have raised your child to be brave and authentic and true to themselves. All the things I failed to teach her. You did teach her those things, I corrected gently. You taught her through negative example by showing her what kind of life she didn't want. That's still teaching, even if it wasn't the lesson you intended. And she became an incredible woman, in part because she had something to define herself against. We're all shaped by our parents, whether we follow their path or forge our own. We spent the rest of the evening going through Sarah's things together, sharing stories and memories, laughing at photographs of her awkward teenage years, and marveling at essays she had written in high school that showed her gift for language and her passionate belief in education as a tool for empowerment. I learned that she had been captain of the debate team, that she had volunteered at homeless shelters even when her father had disapproved, that she had written poetry that was surprisingly good. Each new discovery was like finding another piece of a puzzle, filling in the gaps in my understanding of who Sarah had been before she became mine. When I finally left that night, my car loaded with boxes of Sarah's past, I felt something shift inside me. The grief was still there, as heavy and painful as ever, but it was accompanied now by a deeper understanding and a strange sense of gratitude. Sarah had chosen me knowing full well what she was giving up, and that made our love even more precious and profound. She had looked at a life of luxury and chosen instead a life of authenticity with me, and that was the greatest gift anyone had ever given me. The following months brought more changes as I began to make decisions about the trust fund Sarah had left me. Richard was true to his word, placing no conditions or expectations on how I used the money, simply making sure I had access to what was rightfully mine through Sarah's will. I paid off my student loans first, that burden I had been carrying for years, suddenly gone in a single transaction. Then I set up a scholarship fund in Sarah's name at the school where she had taught, ensuring that 5 students every year would have their college education fully funded. Sarah had always believed that education was the key to breaking cycles of poverty and giving children opportunities to define their own futures, and this felt like the right way to honor that belief. I also donated a significant amount to various educational charities, causes Sarah had cared about, funding literacy programs and library expansions and teacher training initiatives. Each donation felt like I was putting Sarah's values into action, using the money she had inherited from her mother to make the kind of difference she had always wanted to make. But I also kept enough to make some changes in my own life, changes I thought Sarah would have approved of. I left my teaching position at the high school, not because I stopped loving teaching, but because I wanted to try something Sarah and I had often talked about late at night, writing full-time. I had always wanted to be a writer, had notebooks full of story ideas and half-finished manuscripts, but I had never had the financial security to pursue it seriously. Now I did. I moved out of the apartment Sarah and I had shared, not because I wanted to forget her, but because every corner held memories that were too painful to face every day. I bought a small house in the mountains, nothing extravagant but peaceful and quiet, with large windows that let in natural light and a study where I could write. I filled it with Sarah's things, her teacup collection displayed in the kitchen, her favorite books lining the shelves, photographs of her throughout the years covering the walls. It was a shrine to her memory, but also a space for me to heal and create and move forward. Richard visited sometimes, usually on Sundays, and we established a comfortable routine. We would have coffee and talk about Sarah, then spend time working on what had become our shared project, compiling Sarah's journals and essays and letters into a book about her life and philosophy. Richard had suggested it, thinking that Sarah's words about authenticity, courage, and choosing your own path might inspire others who felt trapped by expectations or afraid to pursue their dreams. I had agreed because it felt like a way to keep Sarah's voice alive, to share her wisdom with the world. As I read through her journals, I discovered so much about her inner life that she had never shared with me. The fear she had felt when she first left her father's house, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake. The loneliness of those first months living on her own, working jobs that barely paid rent, questioning whether freedom was worth the sacrifice. The joy she had felt when she was accepted into the teaching program, finally having a path forward that was entirely her own choosing. And then, pages and pages about me, about how she had fallen in love despite her determination to keep her distance, about how I had made her believe in happiness again. "He doesn't know who I was," she had written a month after we met, and that's terrifying and liberating at the same time. With him, I get to be just Sarah. No history, no baggage, no expectations. He likes me for who I am right now, in this moment, and that's something I've never experienced before. Everyone in my old life knew me as Richard Ashford's daughter, defined me by that relationship, judged me through that lens, but David just sees me. It's intoxicating and terrifying because what if I'm not enough? What if, stripped of the Ashford name and wealth and status, there's nothing interesting about me? What if he gets bored? But then, Months later, she had written, "He's not going to get bored. I realize that now, because he fell in love with the parts of me that money can't buy, the parts that are genuinely me. My sense of humor, my passion for teaching, my terrible singing voice that I refuse to be embarrassed about, my tendency to cry at commercials, my stubborn insistence on trying to bake even though I'm awful at it. These are the things he loves, and these are the things that would be exactly the same whether I was rich or poor. I've finally found someone who loves me for my soul, not my circumstances, and it's the most precious thing I've ever had." Reading those words written in her handwriting was both painful and healing. She had loved me as deeply as I had loved her, had chosen me consciously and completely, had never regretted her decision to leave her old life behind, and knowing that made the grief more bearable somehow, because our love had been real and pure and true, built on solid ground, even if that ground had been hiding secrets. 1 year after Sarah's death, Richard and I held a memorial service at the cemetery, a small gathering of the people who had loved her. Her former students came, some of them traveling from far away, and they shared stories about how Sarah had changed their lives, how she had believed in them when no one else did, how she had inspired them to pursue their dreams. Her teaching colleagues spoke about her passion and dedication, her ability to connect with even the most difficult students, her infectious enthusiasm that made everyone around her want to be better. And Richard spoke about his daughter, the brave woman who had had the courage to choose her own path, who had valued authenticity over comfort, who had taught him through her absence what really mattered in life. "My daughter showed me that love isn't about control," he said, his voice steady despite the tears on his cheeks. "It's about trust and respect and letting go. I failed her in life by trying to dictate her choices, but I won't fail her in death. I'm honoring her memory by being the father I should have been, by supporting the man she loved, by using my resources to further the causes she believed in. Sarah changed both of us," he said, gesturing to me. "She taught us what it means to live with integrity and courage, and even though she's gone, that lesson remains." I spoke last, standing beside her grave with the weight of everything I had learned about her pressing down on my chest. "Sarah was the most authentic person I've ever known," I said. "She lived according to her values, even when it cost her everything. She chose love over luxury, meaning over money, freedom over security. And she never regretted those choices, not for a single day. I know that because I read her journals, because I've spent this past year getting to know her even more deeply than I did when she was alive. I know that she died happy, surrounded by a life she had built for herself, doing work she loved, with a future she was excited about. That doesn't make losing her any easier, but it does give me peace to know that her time with us, however brief, was exactly what she wanted it to be." I paused, looking at the faces gathered around the grave, all these people whose lives Sarah had touched. "She also taught me about legacy," I continued. "Not the kind of legacy you leave through money or status or grand achievements, but the kind you leave through the lives you touch and the love you give and the example you set. Sarah's legacy lives on in every student she inspired, in every person she encouraged to be brave, in every choice she made that showed us it's possible to live authentically, even in a world that pressures us to conform. And now it's up to us to carry that legacy forward, to honor her memory by living with the same courage and integrity she showed us was possible." As the service ended and people began to disperse, Richard and I remained at the grave. He had brought flowers, expensive orchids from some exclusive florist, but I had brought wildflowers I had picked myself from the field near my house, the kind of simple, unpretentious blooms Sarah had always preferred. We placed them together on her grave, a symbol of how we had learned to blend our different worlds in honor of the woman who had connected us. "Thank you," Richard said quietly, "for letting me into your life, for sharing Sarah with me, for helping me understand who she really was. I know it hasn't been easy for you, having me around, constantly reminded of the secrets she kept." I shook my head. "You're not a reminder of secrets. You're a connection to Sarah, to parts of her I never got to know. And besides, I think she would be happy that we found each other, that we're supporting each other through this grief. She loved us both, and she would want us to be family." "Family," Richard repeated, testing the word. "I like that. I never had much family, just Sarah after her mother died. But now I have you, and the memory of the grandchild I'll never meet. And somehow that's enough. It has to be enough." We stood in silence for a while, both lost in our own thoughts and memories. Then Richard spoke again. I'm thinking about making some changes to the foundation my wife established before she died. It currently funds arts programs, which is wonderful, but I want to add an education component, focused on literacy and teacher training, the things Sarah cared about. Would you be willing to help me shape that vision? To make sure we're honoring Sarah's values and actually making a difference rather than just throwing money at problems? I smiled because it felt so right, so perfectly aligned with what Sarah would have wanted. I'd be honored, I said. Sarah always believed that education was the key to everything, to breaking cycles of poverty, to giving people the tools to define their own futures, to creating a more just and compassionate world. If we can further that mission in her name, that would be the best tribute we could give her. And so began a new chapter, one where Richard and I worked together to create something meaningful from our shared loss. The Ashford Foundation's education initiative grew rapidly, funding teacher training programs in underprivileged areas, creating libraries in communities that had none, providing scholarships for students who wanted to become educators. Each program we developed, we asked ourselves what Sarah would think, how she would approach the problem, what she would prioritize. And slowly, her vision became reality, reaching more children and communities than she ever could have touched in her lifetime as a single teacher. 2 years after Sarah's death, I finished writing her biography, a book that told her story honestly, including both the privilege she had been born into and the courage she had shown in walking away from it. Richard had been worried that it would paint him in an unflattering light, and I was honest with him. It did show his mistakes, his attempts to control Sarah's life, the ultimatum that had driven her away. But it also showed his growth, his regret, his dedication to honoring her memory by becoming the father he should have been. When the book was published, it resonated with people in ways I hadn't expected. I received countless letters from readers who had felt trapped by their family's expectations, who had been afraid to pursue their own dreams, who had struggled with the question of whether they owed their parents obedience or owed themselves authenticity. Sarah's story gave them permission to choose themselves, to define success on their own terms, to believe that a meaningful life was worth more than a comfortable one. Some of the letters came from parents who saw themselves in Richard, who recognized their own attempts to control their children's lives and realized the damage it was causing. They wrote about making different choices, about learning to listen and respect their children's autonomy, about redefining their relationship from one of control to one of support. And knowing that Sarah's story was changing lives, preventing other families from experiencing the same rupture that had torn hers apart, brought me more comfort than I can express. The book's success led to speaking engagements, appearances on podcasts and morning shows, invitations to talk about authenticity and courage and living according to your values. I was uncomfortable with the attention at first, but Richard encouraged me, reminding me that this was another way to honor Sarah, to spread her message to even more people. So I accepted the invitations, and I spoke about Sarah, about the choice she had made and why it mattered, about the importance of creating space for people to define their own paths. And always I emphasized that her story wasn't about rejecting family or wealth in themselves, but about rejecting the attempt to control someone's fundamental life choices. During one interview, the host asked me if I had forgiven Sarah for keeping secrets from me, for not telling me about her past and her pregnancy. It was a question I had asked myself 1,000 times, lying awake at night, wrestling with the complicated feelings that came with loving someone who had kept such significant parts of themselves hidden. Forgiveness implies that she did something wrong, I answered carefully, and I'm not sure she did. She made choices that seemed right to her in the moment, choices designed to protect the life she had built and the relationship we shared. She was planning to tell me everything, had letters written and an appointment scheduled, but she ran out of time. I can't be angry at her for that. Death doesn't wait for perfect timing. I paused, gathering my thoughts. What I feel isn't really about forgiveness because there's nothing to forgive. What I feel is grief for the conversations we never got to have, the life we never got to build together with full transparency. But I also feel gratitude for the time we did have, for the love we shared, for the impact she had on my life. Sarah taught me what it means to live with integrity, to choose courage over comfort, to value authenticity above everything else. Those lessons didn't disappear when I learned about her secrets. If anything, understanding the full scope of what she gave up to be with me makes those lessons even more powerful. The interviewer nodded thoughtfully. And what about your relationship with her father? That must be complicated, building a connection with someone who represents the world she ran from. It is complicated, I admitted, but it's also healing. Richard and I were both broken by losing Sarah, both carrying regrets and what-ifs that threatened to consume us. By coming together, by sharing our memories and grief, we've been able to help each other find peace. He's not the villain of Sarah's story. He's a flawed person who made mistakes and has dedicated the rest of his life to making amends. That's all any of us can do. Recognize our failures and try to do better. After that interview aired, I received a message from someone I hadn't expected. The man Sarah had been engaged to before she left. The son of Richard's business associate whose arranged marriage had precipitated her departure. His name was Marcus, and he wrote to tell me that he had never wanted the engagement either. Had felt just as trapped by his parents' expectations as Sarah had. He had gone through with the wedding to someone else his parents had chosen, and he was miserable, living a life that looked perfect on the outside but felt empty on the inside. Sarah's story had given him the courage to finally make a change, to pursue divorce, and build the life he actually wanted. Tell Mr. Ashford I don't blame him, Marcus wrote. We were all products of a system that valued status over happiness. But that system is changing, thanks in part to stories like Sarah's that show there's another way. I'm grateful to her even though I never really knew her. She blazed a trail that's making it easier for the rest of us to follow. I shared that message with Richard, and I watched as he wept with relief and regret, relieved that Marcus didn't hate him, regretful that his actions had caused pain to yet another young person. But I also watched as he used that regret as fuel, doubling down on his commitment to the Foundation's work, to supporting young people in pursuing their dreams rather than their parents' expectations. He even started a program specifically for children from wealthy families, recognizing that privilege came with its own set of pressures and constraints that needed to be addressed. 3 years after Sarah's death, on what would have been her 32nd birthday, I did something I had been planning for months. I took a portion of the trust fund money, and I bought the school where Sarah had taught, which was in danger of closing due to budget cuts and declining enrollment. I renovated it completely, creating bright, welcoming classrooms, a library that Sarah would have loved, a garden where students could learn about nature and growth. I hired teachers who shared Sarah's philosophy about education being a tool for empowerment, who believed in seeing the potential in every student, who understood that their job was not just to teach subjects, but to inspire young people to believe in themselves. We renamed it the Sarah Miller Academy, and above the entrance I had carved one of the quotes from her childhood bedroom wall: "Be brave enough to create the life you dream of, not the life others expect." Richard was there for the opening ceremony, as were many of Sarah's former students and colleagues. We had a moment of silence for Sarah, remembering the woman who had believed so deeply in the power of education, and then we opened the doors to welcome our first class of students. Watching those children enter the building, seeing their faces light up at the colorful classrooms and well-stocked library, I felt Sarah's presence more strongly than I had in years. This was her legacy, made tangible and real. This was her dream, realized through the resources she had left behind. And this was her gift, not just to me, but to all the children whose lives would be changed by the education they received within these walls. As the years passed, I found myself healing in ways I hadn't thought possible. The grief never disappeared completely, and there were still days when I missed Sarah so intensely that I could barely function. Days when I saw something that would have made her laugh or read something she would have loved, and the absence hit me all over again like a fresh wound. But there were also days of peace, days when I could think about her and smile instead of cry, days when I felt grateful for the time we had rather than bitter about the time we lost. I never remarried, though not because I was waiting for Sarah or unable to move on. I simply never met anyone who made me want to try building that kind of life again. My relationship with Sarah had been so profound, so transformative, that anything else felt like it would be a pale imitation. But I built a full life nonetheless, filled with meaningful work and deep friendships and the satisfaction of knowing I was honoring Sarah's memory in ways that mattered. Richard became like a father to me, the relationship evolving from grief companions to genuine family. He taught me about business and investment, skills I used to grow the trust fund and increase our ability to do good through the foundation. I taught him about literature and philosophy, introducing him to the books Sarah had loved and helping him understand the ideas that had shaped her worldview. We traveled together sometimes, visiting places Sarah had dreamed of seeing, scattering small portions of her ashes in locations she had mentioned wanting to visit. We took her to Paris, to the Louvre, where she had wanted to see the Impressionists. We took her to Japan during cherry blossom season, something she had talked about experiencing. We took her to a small village in Peru, where she had planned to volunteer teaching English. Each trip was both painful and cathartic, a way of giving Sarah the adventures she had been denied by her too short life. And through it all, I wrote. I wrote about love and loss, about secrets and truth, about the courage it takes to live authentically. Some of it was published, some remained in journals, but all of it was a way of processing my experience, of making meaning from grief, of ensuring that Sarah's impact on my life continued to ripple outward into the world. The book about Sarah's life led to others, exploring themes of family expectation versus personal authenticity, the cost of privilege, the meaning of success. Each book felt like a continuation of the conversation Sarah and I had started, extending her philosophy and challenging readers to examine their own lives and choices. On the 5th anniversary of Sarah's death, I stood once again at her grave, but this time, I wasn't alone. Richard was there, as he always was for these milestone moments, but there were also about 50 other people, a crowd that had gathered to celebrate Sarah's life and legacy. There were her former students, now young adults pursuing their dreams in fields as diverse as medicine and art and social work, all of them crediting Sarah with believing in them first. There were teachers from the Sarah Miller Academy, sharing stories about students whose lives had been transformed by the education they received in her name. There were foundation staff members, talking about the thousands of children who had been reached by our literacy programs and scholarship funds. And there were readers of the book, people who had never met Sarah but felt connected to her story, inspired by her courage, motivated to make different choices in their own lives because of her example. I looked around at all these people, all these lives that Sarah had touched either directly or indirectly, and I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had lived only 28 years, but the impact of those years would ripple forward for generations. Children who received scholarships in her name would go on to make their own contributions to the world. Teachers trained through foundation programs would inspire thousands more students. Readers of her story would make braver choices, live more authentically, create change in their own families and communities. This was what legacy really meant, not buildings with your name on them or wealth passed down through generations, but lives changed, possibilities opened, courage inspired. When it was my turn to speak to the gathered crowd, I talked about how Sarah had taught me to redefine success. She could have had everything the world tells us to want, I said. Wealth, status, security, comfort. But she chose something else instead. She chose freedom and authenticity and love. She chose a life where she had to work for everything she had, where nothing came easy, where she struggled sometimes to make ends meet. And she was happier in that life than she ever could have been in the gilded cage she left behind. That's not a rejection of wealth or privilege in themselves. It's a rejection of the idea that those things matter more than being true to yourself. Sarah understood that the most valuable things in life, love, purpose, integrity, freedom, can't be bought or inherited. They have to be chosen, fought for, protected, and she was willing to sacrifice everything else to have them. I paused, looking at Richard, who was crying openly. She also taught us about forgiveness and growth. The story of Sarah's life isn't just about her courage in leaving. It's also about the reconciliation that was beginning when she died. She was planning to bridge the gap between her old world and her new one, to make peace with her father while maintaining the boundaries she needed. That kind of nuanced approach where you can forgive someone and still protect yourself, where you can love someone and still refuse to let them control you, that's wisdom we all need. Life isn't usually about completely cutting people off or completely submitting to their will. It's about finding the middle ground where relationships can exist on healthier terms. I turned to address the former student specifically. For those of you who knew Sarah as a teacher, I want you to know that you weren't just students to her. You were her purpose, her reason for getting up every morning, her greatest source of joy. She believed in every single one of you, saw potential in you that maybe you couldn't see in yourselves yet. And the success you've achieved, the people you've become, that would make her so incredibly proud. You are her living legacy, walking proof that one person really can make a difference by simply believing in others and showing up with dedication and love. Finally, I addressed everyone gathered. Thank you for being here, for remembering Sarah, for carrying her values forward into the world. The best way we can honor her memory is to live the lesson she taught us, to be brave enough to create the lives we dream of, to choose authenticity over approval, to value meaning over comfort. Sarah's time on earth was far too short, but the impact of that time is eternal because it lives on in all of us. After the ceremony, as people slowly dispersed, Richard and I remained behind as we always did. We stood in silence for a while, both lost in memories and grief that time had softened but not erased. I think about the grandchild I never got to meet, Richard said quietly. I wonder what they would have been like, whether they would have had Sarah's eyes, your love of books, her courage, your kindness. I wonder if they would have been a teacher like both their parents, or chosen some completely different path. I had thought about this too, countless times, imagining the child Sarah had been carrying when she died. I like to think they would have been brave, I said. Like Sarah, that they would have had her integrity and determination, her ability to know what she wanted and go after it despite obstacles. And I like to think we would have raised them to value authenticity, to understand that success isn't about money or status, but about living according to your values. You would have been a wonderful father, Richard said. You would have given that child the kind of support and respect I failed to give Sarah. You would have let them choose their own path. We would have, I corrected gently. Both of us together. Because you've changed, Richard. You've learned from your mistakes. You would have been the grandfather that child deserved, the one who supported rather than controlled, who guided rather than dictated. Sarah was planning to let you into our lives because she believed in second chances, believed people could grow and change, and you've proven her right. Richard squeezed my shoulder gratefully, and we stood there together as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Sarah would have loved. Do you think she's at peace? Richard asked. Do you think she knows what we've done in her name? How many lives we've touched? I think if there's anything after death, any kind of awareness or continuation, then yes, she knows, I answered. And I think she's proud of us. Proud that we found each other. Proud that we turned our grief into something meaningful. Proud that we've tried to live up to the example she set. But more than that, I think she's at peace because she lived the life she wanted, died doing work she loved, surrounded by a reality she had created for herself. Not everyone gets that, and she knew how precious it was. As darkness fell and we finally prepared to leave, I placed my hand one last time on Sarah's headstone. Thank you, I whispered, speaking to her spirit or memory or whatever remained. Thank you for choosing me, for loving me, for teaching me what courage looks like. Thank you for the 4 years we had, for the life you built with me, for the legacy you left behind. I'll keep honoring it, keep spreading your message, keep trying to live up to the example you set. Until we meet again, my love. Richard and I walked back to our cars together, but before we parted ways, he stopped me. I have something I want to discuss with you, he said. I'm getting older, and I've been thinking about succession planning for the foundation and the company. I'd like you to consider taking a leadership role in the foundation, maybe even joining the company board. You understand Sarah's values better than anyone, and you have the vision to ensure that our work continues to honor her memory and make a real difference. I was surprised by the offer, but I understood the logic behind it. Let me think about it, I said. That's a big responsibility, and I want to make sure I could do it justice. Of course, Richard said. There's no rush. Just know that I trust you completely, and I believe Sarah would approve. Your family, and I want to make sure that everything we've built together continues long after I'm gone. As I drove home that night, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this point. 5 years ago, I had been a simple high school teacher, in love with a woman I thought I knew completely, planning a modest future that seemed perfect in its simplicity. Then, in the span of one terrible moment, I had lost everything, or so I thought. But from that loss had come unexpected gifts, a father figure in Richard, a deeper understanding of Sarah, a purpose that extended far beyond my own happiness, and the resources to make a real difference in the world. I had learned that truth is complicated, that people are complex, that love can coexist with secrets, and that grief can transform into something meaningful if we're willing to do the work. I had learned that legacy isn't about what you leave behind in material terms, but about the lives you touch and the change you inspire. And I had learned that sometimes the most important relationships in our lives come from the most unexpected places. That family isn't always defined by blood, but by shared love and shared purpose. Sarah had been gone for 5 years, but in many ways, she was more present in my life than ever. Her values guided my decisions, her courage inspired my choices, her memory motivated me to be better. And through the foundation's work, through the school that bore her name, through the book that told her story, she continued to touch lives and change trajectories and inspire people to live more authentically. This is what I want you to understand: that tragedy can become transformation, that loss can lead to legacy, that even in our deepest grief, we have choices about what we do next. Sarah chose courage when she left her father's house. Richard chose growth when he learned from his mistakes. And I chose meaning when I decided to honor Sarah's memory by living according to her values and spreading her message. What will you choose? When you face your own moments of loss, betrayal, grief, or confusion, will you let them define you or transform you? Will you hide from the truth or seek it out, even when it's painful? Will you build walls or bridges? Will you choose comfort or courage? I'm not saying it's easy. 5 years later, I still have days when the grief overwhelms me, when I miss Sarah so intensely that I can barely function. But I also have days filled with purpose and meaning and the satisfaction of knowing that her too short life continues to make a difference through the work we're doing in her name. And that's enough. It has to be enough. Because we don't get to control how long we live, we only get to control how we live. Sarah understood that, lived it, died, knowing she had created a life aligned with her values. And in doing so, she left behind a blueprint for the rest of us. A reminder that authentic living is always possible if we're brave enough to choose it. So if this story has touched you in any way, if Sarah's courage has inspired you, or if you've ever felt torn between expectation and authenticity, I want you to do something for me. I want you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me about a time when you had to choose between what others expected and what you truly wanted. Tell me how you navigated that choice, or if you're still trying to figure it out, because your story matters too. And by sharing it, you might inspire someone else who's struggling with the same questions. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you think differently about success or family or courage, please leave a like on this video. Your engagement helps us reach more people with Sarah's message, helps us spread the idea that authentic living is worth fighting for. Subscribe to Through My Eyes for more stories that explore the complexity of human experience, the courage it takes to live authentically, and the unexpected ways that loss can transform into meaning. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might change the way you think about your own life and choices. Remember, you have the power to create the life you dream of, not the life others expect. Be brave enough to use it. Thank you for listening to Sarah's story, to our story, and for being part of the community that keeps her legacy alive.